The forest was quiet that night, too quiet for Jack's liking. At 60 years old, he'd lived by the edge of these woods long enough to know its rhythm, the owls, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of coyotes. But that night something felt different. The air was heavy with mist and the moon hung low, silver and cold. Over the forgotten cemetery behind the old pine ridge, Jack walked the narrow dirt trail with a lantern in his hand, checking the traps he'd set earlier that day. But then he stopped. There, in by the far fence under the dying pine tree, when something moved. A massive dark figure kneeling, not prowling, not feeding, kneeling. He squinted through the fog. The shape was too large to be a man, too still to be an animal. The faint beam of his lantern caught the outline of broad shoulders, long arms, and matted fur that glistened in the moonlight. Jack's pulse quickened, but his instincts told him not to run. The creature wasn't hunting. It was mourning. Its great head hung low, one arm resting on the small mound of earth before it. A grave, marked with rough stones and wildflowers. Jack stepped back slowly, breath shallow. Every night it came back to the same grave, and like a soul who couldn't move on. Jack didn't sleep much that night. The image of that massive shadow kneeling under the pine tree wouldn't leave his mind. Logic told him to forget it, to chalk it up to tired eyes and an overactive imagination. But deep down he knew what he saw was real. There was no mistaking that kind of sorrow. The next night he returned. The moon was thinner, the mist heavier, and the cold seemed to bite through his coat. He moved carefully, keeping to the darker parts of the trail until he reached the old cemetery. From behind a crumbling stone wall he crouched low, his lantern turned off. Only the faint silver light of the moon guided his eyes. And there it was again, the same dark figure. It stepped slowly out of the tree line, shoulders hunched, breathing visible in the cold air. Each step was deliberate, respectful. When it reached the same grave, it lowered itself to one knee. Jack's heart pounded. In its hand, the creature held something small, a cluster of wildflowers damp from the river's edge. It placed them gently on the grave, arranging them with fingers too large for such delicate care. Then for a long moment it stayed still. A low sound filled the air, not a growl, not a snarl, but something between a sigh and a hum. The kind of sound that came from deep inside, carrying pain words could never hold. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The creature wasn't just visiting him, it was remembering. The motion, the stillness, the offering, and it all felt deliberate, ritualistic. He could almost feel the weight of the creature's grief. He stayed hidden, afraid to break whatever sacred moment was happening before him. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Jack whispered under his breath, barely able to believe it himself. Whatever lay beneath that soil meant something to him. By morning, Jack couldn't shake what he'd seen. The image of that enormous creature kneeling at the grave stayed with him like a shadow that wouldn't fade. He had to know the truth, who or what was buried there. He waited until daylight when the fog began to lift from the treetops. The old cemetery looked different under the sun, calmer but still lonely. Most of the graves were covered in moss and leaning at odd angles, the names barely visible. Yet one spot stood apart, the grave beneath the dying pine. Jack knelt beside it. There was no headstone, only a small mound of earth framed by two rough stones. But when he brushed away the wet leaves, he noticed something unusual, faint carvings on the stones. Not letters, symbols, simple shapes crudely scratched like someone trying to mark a place of meaning without knowing how to write. It wasn't a human grave. Not officially. Around it, the ground told its own story. A few strands of coarse brown fur clung to the bark of a nearby tree. Broken twigs, fresh impressions in the mud, wide, deep footprints twice the size of a man's. This was no illusion. The creature had been coming here often. Jack stood quietly, piecing it together. Somewhere deep inside, the feeling of fear was replaced by something else. Sorrow. Later that afternoon, he stopped by the old diner in town. Over coffee, he asked around about the cemetery. Most folks didn't pay it much mind, but one older man remembered something. There used to be a boy, the man said, maybe 12, 13. Used to wander those woods years ago. Said he had a friend out there, a big one. Folks thought he was making it up till he disappeared one winter. Never found a trace of him. Jack's hand tightened around his cup. The story fit too well, a boy and a giant in the woods. That night, as the wind howled outside his cabin, Jack whispered the thought that had begun to haunt him. Maybe that grave doesn't belong to a monster's victim. Maybe it belongs to his only friend. Jack returned the following night, driven by something he couldn't quite explain. Not curiosity, but compassion. The forest was still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. A faint silver moon cut through the mist, casting long shadows over the cemetery. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. He hid behind the same crumbling stone wall, heart steady but cautious. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, before he heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the leaves. Then, from between the trees, the figure appeared. It was even larger than he remembered. 8 feet tall easily, shoulders broad, fur dark with streaks of silver glinting under the moonlight. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost human in their weight. He noticed deep scars across its arms and ribs, old wounds, healed but visible. This was a creature that had known struggle. The Bigfoot knelt before the grave just as before. It set down something, a few wildflowers crushed slightly in its hand. Then it bowed its head, exhaling a sound that wasn't quite a growl, not quite a sigh. It was sorrow. Jack felt no fear this time. He stepped out from behind the wall, quietly, each footstep gentle. The creature didn't move. It turned its head slightly, watching him with those deep amber eyes that held grief, weariness, and something strangely familiar, understanding. Jack stopped a few feet away and slowly sat down on a fallen branch, keeping his distance. He didn't speak, didn't want to break whatever this was. For a long moment, man and creature shared the silence. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the soft patter of leaves falling from above. Then, the Bigfoot lifted one massive hand and pressed it against the ground beside the grave. Gentle, reverent. It glanced toward Jack, holding his gaze for just a moment. In that look, Jack felt something pass between them. No words, just a message. When you see me, you understand? He nodded slowly. The creature lowered its head again. For the first time, Jack realized this wasn't just a beast haunting a grave. This was someone mourning, someone who had lost. As the moonlight faded behind the clouds, Jack whispered softly, barely audible, "You're not alone, friend." And though the creature didn't move, its heavy breathing slowed, as if it understood. The next morning, Jack couldn't rest. The image of that towering creature kneeling beside the grave refused to leave his mind. He needed to know why. Over the next few days, he began asking questions, quiet ones. Old men at the diner, the woman who ran the general store, even the local historian who kept piles of forgotten records. Most people just shrugged or changed the subject. But one name kept surfacing: Eli Turner, a boy who vanished nearly 50 years ago near these woods. Jack followed the trail to what was left of the Turner family's old cabin, half sunk into the ground and covered with ivy. Inside, beneath the dust and rot, he found a small wooden box tucked under a loose floorboard. Inside it, a few trinkets, a slingshot, a river stone, and a weathered journal. The handwriting was shaky but childlike. The words told a story that made Jack's throat tighten. "Mama says the forest is dangerous, but he's not. He brings me berries. I bring him bread. He's funny. He doesn't talk, but he listens. He got scared of thunder last night. I held his hand. I think he's my friend." The final entry was smudged with water damage, the ink fading. "I feel sick today." I told him not to worry. He sat outside the window until I fell asleep. The last page ended there. Jack closed the book slowly, staring at the small grave in his mind's eye. The truth settled over him like the mist outside, heavy but pure. That creature, that giant everyone feared, had been just a young Bigfoot then, a wild thing that somehow found kindness in a lonely boy. When the child died, it hadn't run away. It had stayed. It had buried him right there, marking the spot with stones and flowers. And for all the years that followed, through storms, winters, and moonlit nights, it had returned, the only way it knew how to remember. Jack stood beside the grave that evening, the wind whispering through the pines. He spoke softly, not sure to whom. He never forgot the one human who saw him not as a monster but as a friend. And in that moment, Jack understood. Grief doesn't belong to one species. It belongs to every heart that has ever loved and lost. Jack waited until the moon was high again, pale and thin behind the drifting mist. He knew the creature would return, Somehow he could feel it in his chest, like the echo of a promise kept for too long. He parked far from the cemetery this time and walked the last stretch on foot. The night was colder than before, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked pine. Each step on the damp earth seemed louder than it should have been, like he was intruding on something sacred. And then he saw it. The Bigfoot was already there, kneeling by the same small grave beneath the crooked pine tree. But tonight something was different. In its huge weathered hands it held a small wooden carving. Jack crept closer, his breath trembling until the shape came into view. It was the crude but careful figure of a child's face, round, simple, and kind. Not perfect, but made with love. The creature placed it on the grave as though it were laying down its heart. Then it stayed still, completely still. Rain fell from its fur in silver streaks, and its great shoulders shook once, twice. A silent sob caught between breaths. Jack's eyes burned. He knew what he was witnessing wasn't some wild beast's instinct. It was loyalty, the kind only born from love and loss. He took a hesitant step forward, boots sinking softly into the mud. The creature turned, amber eyes glowing faintly under the moonlight. There was no fear there, only exhaustion, grief, and something achingly human. Jack didn't speak. He just nodded, letting the moment breathe. The Bigfoot looked at him for a long time, as if deciding whether to trust him with the weight of its pain. Then, with slow movements, it touched the ground near the carving, its massive hand tracing the edge of the boy's grave, the way a mother might trace a name on a tombstone. Jack knelt too, a few feet away. Rain pattered softly between them. He whispered, "He mattered to you, didn't he?" The creature made a low, trembling sound, not a growl, not a cry, something between. A sound of mourning. For a long time they stayed like that. Two figures in the rain, divided by everything and yet bound by something deeper. The world was quiet except for the rhythm of water on leaves and the fragile heartbeat of sorrow they shared. As Jack finally rose to leave, he looked back once more. The Bigfoot hadn't moved. It sat beside the grave, one giant hand resting protectively near the little wooden carving. Jack thought, grief doesn't speak and it remembers, and that night, he knew he would never forget what he'd seen. A creature not of myth but of mourning. The nights had grown quieter. Jack hadn't seen movement by the cemetery for 3 evenings, and part of him feared the creature might never return. But something inside told him he had to go one last time. To bear witness, not out of curiosity but respect. The forest was drenched in silver light that night. Mist clung to the gravestones, and the air carried that deep earthy scent that comes before dawn. Jack stood behind the same old stone wall, lantern dimmed, heart steady. And then he saw him. The Bigfoot was there again, kneeling before the small grave, larger than life, yet so heartbreakingly still. The wooden carving still lay before him, wet with dew. The creature's head was bowed, hands resting gently on the mound of earth as if in prayer. No sound came from him this time. No hum, no sob, only silence. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. The world around them seemed frozen in mourning. As the first streaks of dawn brushed through the fog, the creature finally stirred. Slowly it rose to its full towering height, shoulders sagging, breath visible in the cold air. For a moment it looked toward the horizon, toward the forest that had hidden him all his life. Then without a sound he turned and began walking back into the trees. Jack didn't follow. He knew this was goodbye. When daylight came, he approached the grave one final time. The ground was undisturbed, the wildflowers freshened by rain. The wooden carving sat perfectly still atop the mound, untouched, peaceful. Jack knelt beside it, touched the rough wood with trembling fingers, and whispered softly. Maybe he knew it was time to let go. Or maybe in his way, he found peace. As he stood and looked toward the forest, the mist lifted slowly, revealing empty paths and quiet branches. For the first time in many nights, the woods felt calm, not haunted, but healed. Weeks passed, and the forest slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, the kind only the old woods know. The owls called again, the creek ran clear, and the mist that once clung to the cemetery began to lift earlier each morning. But for Jack, something had changed forever. He often found himself walking that same trail at dusk, not to hunt or check traps, but to listen, to feel the stillness where something once breathed with sorrow. Each step toward that old pine tree carried a strange peace, the kind that came only after witnessing something sacred. The grave was always there, small and humble, the stones now settled deep in the soil. The wooden carving, though weathered by rain, remained intact, the faint outline of the boy's face still visible. Jack would kneel there sometimes, laying a few wildflowers beside it, not because he believed in myths, but because he'd seen truth with his own eyes, truth that didn't need to be spoken. He never told anyone. Not his neighbors, not the sheriff, not even his brother who'd always mocked his forest tales. Some things, he figured, weren't meant to be explained. Some things belonged only to those who could feel them. At night, when the wind moved through the trees just right, he could almost hear that low hum again. Soft, steady, mournful. He didn't know if it was memory or imagination, but it didn't matter. It was enough to know it once existed. The forest no longer felt haunted. Instead, it felt guarded, like a place where something ancient and kind had found its rest. Jack began to see the beauty in the silence, the grace in the stillness. One evening, as he placed a new bundle of flowers on the grave, he whispered into the dusk, "You're not forgotten." The wind answered softly through the pines, bending the tall grass around the mound almost like a nod. Jack smiled faintly, wiping the moisture from his eyes before it could turn into tears. As he walked back home, the last light of day faded through the trees. The world felt the same, and yet deeply different. He thought about that creature, about the boy, about the quiet bond they shared, something that even death couldn't erase. And in the hush of the forest, his final thought lingered like a prayer. Grief doesn't speak our language. It speaks through silence, through tears, through those who remember. The rain had returned. Soft at first, barely touching the leaves, then steady, the kind that felt less like weather and more like memory. Jack pulled his coat tighter as he made his way down the muddy trail, his boots sinking deep into the softened earth. When he reached the old cemetery, the mist hung low again, curling around the crooked gravestones like ghostly fingers. The pine tree stood still, its branches heavy with rain, and beneath it lay the small grave, unchanged. The wildflowers he'd left the day before were bent but not broken. The wooden carving still rested there, untouched, its surface glistening with fresh droplets. Jack stood in silence, watching the rain fall over the mound. He didn't feel fear anymore, only peace, quiet and deep. Something in that place felt eternal, as if both souls, the boy and the creature, were still there, keeping each other company through the years. He knelt once more, brushed away a fallen leaf, and whispered, "You kept your promise." The rain answered for him, soft and rhythmic, washing over the grave like tears from the sky. He looked toward the forest, its edge blurred by fog, and thought of that massive figure walking away for the last time. Not a monster, not a legend, but something far gentler. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of the story settle inside him. A secret he'd carry to his grave, just as the creature had carried his. At the gate, he looked back one final time. The flowers swayed gently. The carving gleamed faintly in the gray light, and as the rain fell harder, he whispered into the wind. Some friendships outlive breath, time, and even species. He wasn't just a creature, he was a soul that remembered. The forest listened. The rain kept falling, and the story of love, loss, and remembrance lived on in the quiet.